Good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the US FDA for hosting and for having us. And today's presentation will be delivered by myself, Adil Nashed, and my two colleagues, Barbara Wright and Jason Wakelin-Smith. I'll be speaking to you about the sponsor role and oversight responsibilities in global clinical trials, including those trials incorporating novel designs, operational approaches, and data sources, such as RWD and RWE. Barbara will be talking about expanding the use of third parties and service providers performing clinical trial-related activities. And Jason will be the last but not least, will be talking about risk-proportionate oversight measures that will focus on what's important to ensure reliable trial results, trial participant safety, and appropriate decision-making. So, for my presentation, I'll first talk about the overview of the presentation. I'll talk about the clinical trial global status. I'll talk about the new trial designs, and the specific one I'll be talking about today is the adaptive design, and I'll be also touching on the RWD and RWE. Next, I'll be talking about the sponsor oversight and how it's applicable to both the adaptive design and the RWD and RWE. Next, I'll be talking about verifiers of compliance, and this is what the inspectors look for. And last, I will speak about the ICH update. Sponsor obligations. We know that the sponsor is responsible for the overall conduct of the trial. We heard that yesterday also. We know that sponsor can delegate tasks to third parties, however, they cannot delegate responsibilities, and I know my colleague Barbara will speak on this topic. And lastly, we know that the sponsor is responsible for compliance with the applicable regulations, and in Canada, Division 5 of the Canadian Food and Drugs Regulations is the legislation that we enforce for GCP inspections. So, global status of clinical trials. What's happening globally with clinical trials? Well, they're becoming more complex. You ask why? They're now engaging, or they're asking for novel design or new trials. Adaptive design is one of them. More trials are utilizing RWD, RWE, and more trials are utilizing artificial intelligence and machine learning. In Canada, we find that Canadian stakeholders are asking for increasing need to conduct clinical trials using novel designs, and they're asking to change or to increase regulatory coherence across a distinct drug. For us, Health Canada, we recognize the need for integrated regulatory framework that will provide greater transparency, efficiency for stakeholders. So what's new in ICH E6R3 specifically when it comes to the design of the trials? This is specifically for the sponsor oversight. We find that under the type and design of the trial, adaptive design, platform, umbrella basket, decentralized trials have been added, and that's why we're talking today about adaptive design. Also, under criteria for discontinuation of the trial, we find that the dose adjustment and dose interruption has been added. This is all in R3, and the last one is identification of the data entered in case report forms is to be removed. This is from R3 to R2. So let's go to the essence of the topic, adaptive design trials. So it's a design that allows for planned modifications. In essence, adaptive design is defined as a clinical trial design that allows for prospectively planned modifications to one or more aspects of the design based on accumulating data from the subject in the trial. That's very important. It's a seamless design that allows for planned changes. In essence, these changes have to be occurring at pre-specified times during the trial or the life cycle of the trial. Modifications cannot take place at any given time. They have to be pre-planned. And also, adaptations have to be pre-planned as well. Types of adaptive design trials. There's quite a few of them. I picked 4 for the case of, for the sake of time for this presentation. I picked 4 that I'll be expanding on. The number 1 is adaptive randomization design. Adaptive randomization design. What's this design? This design allows alteration to the randomization schedule. And based on varied probabilities of the treatment assignment. The purpose of this is basically to increase the probability of success. Next one is group sequential design. What's this? It's a design that allows the stoppage of the trial completely or prematurely when there is issues with the safety and efficacy. And then depending on the results from the analysis, modifications can be made. Adaptive dose finding design. Is this design, you are identifying the minimum dose and the maximum tolerable dose. And from that, you can determine the dose level for the next phase trials. This design is typically used in early phase trials. Last one is adaptive treatment switching design. And in this design, you can switch patients or participants from one treatment arm to the other, if, again, there are concerns with safety and efficacy. In this type of designs, estimation of survival rate could be difficult if the disease in question has poor prognosis. Advantages of adaptive design trials: flexibility, efficiency, ability to stop the study earlier if proved to be non-effective, better understanding of drug effects, more acceptable to stakeholders. I'm going to stop at the first 2 bullets, flexibility and efficiency. In a conventional study, when a sponsor is applying for approval, during the course of the trial, if there is amendments, the sponsor is required to submit a protocol amendment to the regulator. And in Health Canada, we issue a letter of no objection. So that if the amendments are to be applied for, the sponsor has to wait until they get approval from the regulator. In this case, I'm using Health Canada as an example. For this one, adaptive designs, the potential modifications are approved beforehand by both the regulator and the ethics committee. That's more flexibility, because otherwise, conventionally, a sponsor has to wait to apply for the amendment, and they have to wait till they get the approval before they can implement the amendments. For the efficiency, participants are used more efficiently, and fewer participants, if you may, are given ineffective compounds or ineffective doses that potentially be high. At the same time, pharma companies may use or waste less unsuccessful compounds and can more quickly reassign resources to alternative drugs within their pipelines. So let's compare conventional versus adaptive design trials. Conventional study has a rigid, yes, but very simple study design. Adaptive, on the other hand, has flexible but more complicated. Conventional study for phase 1 to 2 are well defined, while for adaptive can be seamless for phase 2 and 3. For conventional study, the regulatory review is well endorsed, while for adaptive, it's still speculative. Let's talk about limitations of adaptive design. Are there limitations? Yes, there are limitations. And I picked again 4 for the sake of the timelines imposed on this presentation. And the first one, they may require specific analytical methods that may not be readily available. Next, some efficiency aspect of the design, yes, but you can lose efficiency on another part of the trial. I'm going to expand on this in a minute. Next one, there could be some challenges with logistics. And the last one, there could be challenges with interpretability of the results. It's a complex design, so there might be challenges there to interpret the results. I want to give an example on the efficiency and how there could be some issues with efficiency, specifically statistics, and when you apply this to the randomization. If we use an example of adaptive randomization versus the fixed randomization, it was found that if you're using fixed randomization, you are able to have more precise estimate of the treatment. For example, if you have 100 subjects in a trial, and you are going to split 50 in one arm, experimental, and 50 in the other arm, control. This is the fixed one, or the conventional fixed randomization. On the other one, the adaptive design, you will use different number of subjects. So let's say for one arm, experimentally, you're going to use 90 participants, and the other arm, you're going to use or apply 10 participants. It was found that for the one that has used the fixed randomization, you're able to have a more precise estimate of the treatment. And also for the adaptive randomization, it has to be larger and taking longer. So this is just one example to give you about the inefficiency when it came to statistics, when you apply it to randomization for the adaptive design. So in a nutshell, you are having a more precise estimate of the treatment when you're using the fixed randomization. In the example, when you're using the same number of subjects, for example, 50 participants in each arm, 50-50. All right, sponsor oversight. So right now, there aren't any changes for the sponsor oversight because it's still a new topic, and ICH is yet working to approve a document specifically for adaptive design. So the same requirement that we're basically expecting or enforcing will apply. Meaning there has to be quality of the design of the trial. The sponsor has to ensure that trial processes are compliant with this new design. There has to be a criteria for protocol deviations. There has to be decisions made impacting subject safety and data integrity. Next, selection of qualified individuals. This is very important. Sponsor must ensure that staff, site staff are trained on this design. And we do verify this during our inspections because Health Canada Division 5, CO510G talks about the qualifications of staff engaged in a trial. They should be qualified by education, training, and experience. So if you have a new design, the staff at the site should be well trained by the sponsor on it. That's very important. There should be prompt implementation of CAPA. There should establish IDMC, Independent Data Committee, Data Monitoring Committee, when applicable. They should establish the endpoints, and there could be any committees recruited should have written SOPs. In a nutshell, also, the sponsor should have early communication. If the sponsor is considering conducting this new design, they should have early communication with the respective regulator. They should have a rationale. They should have a detailed description of the adaptation plan. And also, they should have information of the responsibilities of the bodies responsible for the implementation of this new design. Verification of compliance. For the adaptive design trials, verify the design is approved by the regulator. That cannot implement any design unless that design is approved by the regulator. Next, the approved design has to be followed by the site. So the site must follow whatever the regulator has approved for them, and we check for that. In Health Canada section CO510B talks about the trial must follow the protocol. The design should follow or should be applied to all the sites. You can't have the design applied to only one site and others not, because that might impact the quality of the data. obviously verify the REB was informed and approved the design. And also the monitoring has to be conducted and designed to be applied for all the sites. So this is, in a nutshell, about adaptive design. Think of it as a more flexible design, but it's more complex. It's pre-planned based on data coming from the subject. This is the summary of this important thing about adaptive design. I'll speak next about RWE and RWD. You might have heard this yesterday by some of the colleagues who spoke about it. So real-world evidence is evidence about the use and potential benefits or risk of a medical product. This evidence is coming from where? It's coming from the analysis of the real-world data, which is data relating to the subject or the patient status and or delivery of health care routinely collected from a variety of sources. Real-world data refers to health-related data that's generated from the course of a patient routine care or post-treatment. And you will be surprised, but there's a large number of sources for this RWD. They could come from the healthcare records, insurance claims, billing activity, medication order records, patients' own data generation via wearables or other at-home medical devices. So there's quite a large number of sources by which you can get this RWD. So in this slide here, I'm showing you that RWD will lead to RWE. So the real-world evidence is coming from the real-world data. It's evidence that you are gathering from the real-world data. So what are the benefits of the real world in clinical trials? Well, gain insight into public health, advanced healthcare, increase drug access for specific patient populations, increase trials visibility. Data collected from clinical trials has some limitations. When we want to compare RWD and RWE and compare it with the clinical trial data, we know the following, that data that's collected from clinical trial is really very high quality controlled data because it's coming from, but the fact it's coming from a specific patient population and highly specialized environment is limiting the generalizability in real world settings. Also, clinical trials might not be always feasible or ethical for certain diseases or disorders as rare diseases, and some patient populations, for example, children, pregnant women, and seniors. The sponsor oversight. Well, it has to be identified in a cover letter. You have to explain why the RWE, RWD was being used. You have to explain how it was gathered. You have to explain or demonstrate how potential biases were mitigated. So, verification of compliance. How do we verify compliance here about this RWE and RWD? Again, I don't want to overlap. We heard yesterday colleagues that spoke to us about the life cycle of data. For the compliance here, we want to verify the source of the RWD. We want to verify the storage of the RWD. We want to verify the reliability of the RWD, basically ACOAC, accurate, legible, complete, original, attributable, and contemporaneous. And you want to verify the qualification of staff who collected the RWD. Again, it's very important that staff who are engaged in this are qualified, as the same with the adaptive design. All the staff have to be qualified, all the staff have to be trained, and also for the sponsor, when they're hiring monitors, the monitors themselves have to be trained on this kind of adaptive designs or the RWE, RWD. That's very important, and we do check for that, like I said earlier. Last thing, what's happening with the ICH update currently? It's a new topic. As we speak, there is no full harmonization between some regulators, and ICH is working on developing guidelines. The anticipated completion is next year. And that brings me to the conclusion of this presentation. I want to thank you all for listening, and I want to present to you my next colleague, Barbara Wright. Thank you.
Hi, so next up, I'd like to talk about the expanded use of contractors and service providers in clinical trials today. I'll start with some discussion of the oversight obligations that sponsors have, talk about the importance of written agreements in those engagements, and then close with a couple of examples from global inspections done by FDA. So let's go. So contract services, traditionally we've seen a lot of areas where contractors have been used in clinical trials. So we've seen site selection and monitoring. We've seen central laboratories used, central radiologists conducting interpretations, IP or investigational product distribution and management, data management, statistics. So those are typically the areas that we've seen over the years in clinical trials, but what we're seeing a lot more of now is the growth areas associated with remote data acquisition. So we heard a lot of discussion yesterday about digital health technologies and how those are used in clinical trials now. Most of those are through the use of some vendor or service provider. So when patients are capturing their symptoms, so the efficacy endpoints in diaries, cell phone apps, wearable devices, tablets at the clinic, when these endpoint data is captured through these electronic devices, a lot of times those are through these third-party service providers. So this is a big growth area in service providers and clinical research. We're also seeing the expanded use of what we call site management organizations, where contract staff are hired to perform tasks at a clinical investigator site, or contractors are used to collect subject level data, sometimes through electronic technologies, or to perform, say, patient, we talked about adaptive or decentralized clinical trials yesterday, and the use of home health nurses, for example, to go to the study subject's home and administer drug or collect efficacy assessments, collect blood samples, so you could have a contract phlebotomist. So this is another area where we see kind of the expanded use of service providers. We're seeing as many as 30, 40 different contractors engaged in a single trial. So it's a lot to keep track of and a lot to consider, a lot for the sponsors to stop and think about and take a thoughtful, risk-based approach to setting up the activities for oversight in that trial. So hit the right button and we'll go. So yesterday we talked a little bit ICH R3. It addresses the use of these service providers in the agreements section. There's a lot of good detail there. I encourage you to read that in the R3 draft. The R2 document also talked about contract research organizations. It outlines the fact that the sponsors retain ultimate responsibility for the trial. I'm going to say that about 12 times in my slide deck. So they can delegate a task, and they can even transfer responsibility through an agreement, and we can hold the contract research organization responsible under our regulations, but that still doesn't absolve the sponsor of responsibility for overseeing the trial. So those transfers ought to be in writing. They should be in adequate detail, and a lot of times you're going to need some associated plans to go with that, and then you have to follow that up with oversight. And yeah, so follow it with oversight to assure that the plan is actually followed. So considerations to look at when contracting services for global clinical trials. Well-written contracts and study plans are going to be essential. And I talk about both because depending on the task and activity, the plan needs to contain adequate detail. I mean, you can't put everything in a contract, right? And no matter what you do to sit down and think about everything that's important to consider and define and train the staff on, you're still going to forget something. So you're still going to need to oversee the execution of those plans. But the contracts and the plans are going to go together: monitoring plans, data management plans, even communication plans, something we probably don't talk enough about. But well-written contracts that include all of the risks when you're taking this risk-based approach, risk to subjects, risk to data, those need to be considered when you're setting up those plans and agreements. And then training people, if you've got a document but nobody's read it and knows what's in it, then you can't expect success when you get to the end of the trial, right? So we need to train the staff. We need to communicate on a regular basis, and we need to check in to make sure that we're on course. If we check in early enough, we can make course corrections. If we wait till the end of the trial, we might end up at a destination no one planned. So. And from the regulator standpoint, we talked a lot about data being fit for purpose. When you get to the end of the trial, we need the study data to have been collected in a way that we can reconstruct the study and have confidence in the data that's coming in the marketing applications. So we're looking for that data to be organized and accessible, but also attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate. Thank you. Audience participation part. Okay, we've also got complete, consistent, enduring, and available. So we could go on and on about all of the characteristics of high quality data, but essentially we're all looking for the same thing, right? We want to know that we can trust the end product. And so to do that, we need to put a lot of thought up front into how are we going to assure that we can have confidence in the end result. So in setting up these agreements for the execution of these trials, there's a lot to consider. Critical roles and responsibilities need to be defined in these agreements and the plans. So some of the things that the sponsor needs to consider, like, is the plan in adequate detail, right? If it's too vague, then we can't expect people to follow, to know what to do, right? So it needs to be, we don't want to leave too much to interpretation. That increases risk to the data and to the subjects. So we want to make sure that all of the roles and responsibilities are assigned in that plan. We want to make sure that the sponsor retains adequate control over the study. So when you hire a contractor, you can't just hand off and walk away, right? You have to make sure that they understand what you expect them to do, and you have to check in on that. Important part of that is being a part of the key documents associated with that service, right? So the sponsor should retain some involvement in the training plans for the staff. So they should need to know that when they hand off a task to a contract service provider, that the service provider is going to ensure that the staff is qualified and trained, understands, and that the sponsor is also involved in any key documents that assure the accurate completion of those tasks. It's also important for the sponsor to know if their service provider is going to hire a subcontractor, or I talk about the subcontractors of subcontractors of subcontractors. With each delegation of those tasks, does the sponsor retain knowledge of those delegations, and do they retain adequate control and access to the data? So has the task been delegated to someone who hired a subcontractor, and now we can't get at the data to verify its accuracy and authenticity? So the sponsor still needs to be able to access that data, even if a subcontractor is used. And they still need to be able to assure that the data has been protected and maintained in compliance with federal regulations. So they should know when a service provider is going to hire additional subcontractors to assist in the tasks that they've been contracted to perform. There we go. So it's important for the sponsor to know if there are going to be limitations, maybe by privacy laws in that region. Maybe there are institutional policies that they need to verify that they're going to be able to access the data come the end of the trial or during the trial to monitor its progress. So institutional policies, there are also in some regions, there may be IT challenges, right, for software or hardware. They may not be able to communicate as well with these sites, may have some limitations in how they can access the data in real time to oversee it, or at the end of the study to make sure that that data is adequately retained. So when thinking about setting up these vendor oversight activities, as we talked yesterday about taking a risk-based approach to things, the sponsor needs to consider all the risks to the study subjects. Now, those can be clinical risks, well-being, the subject's well-being, and those could also be risks to privacy, patient privacy, and the inadvertent release of personal information. Also, they need to consider risk to data, right? So the data system needs to have adequate security, the audit trails, the backup systems, the validated transfer protocols, all of those things that we look at to assure that the data has integrity, that it's not being protected over the entire life cycle from collection to retention. The sponsor needs to consider what do they need to verify that their vendors are going to be compliant in these areas of subject and data protection. When they decide to engage in the oversight activities, the question they have to consider is, how much is enough, right? It's going to be based on the risks associated with what the vendor is performing. So are they determining eligibility? If we get the wrong patient in the trial, it doesn't matter what we do with the data beyond that point. It's kind of useless, right? So are they doing eligibility? Are they managing IP? What tasks is this service provider being involved in, and how critical are those to the execution of the trial? That's going to determine how detailed they need to be when they're assessing prior to engaging with the service provider. So the site selection, can they just send a questionnaire? Do they need to go make a site visit? Can they visit at the beginning and the end of the trial, or do they need to make interim visits? This is all going to be based on what are we asking this vendor to provide, and how critical is it to the success of the trial. So yesterday we talked about digital health technologies, and the guidance on digital health technologies, and the discussions yesterday talked about some of the things to consider. So just as an example, if you're engaging in one of the agreements with one of these service providers, things to consider are looking at what's going to be considered source data and how are we going to assure access for both the sponsor and the regulator. Because if we can't go back in and reconstruct the study and verify its reliability for the marketing application, that's going to be a problem. We need to make sure that all that metadata is available, that it's maintained, reviewed, and retained, right? So it doesn't do any good to have an audit trail if nobody's looking at it. So there was a little discussion about that yesterday in the case studies about the vendor or the sponsor having some kind of algorithm or process of looking at the data for anomalies over the course of the trial. So we need to assure that clinical and privacy risk we talked about with these digital health tools, this digital data, patient information, their personal addresses, make sure that their privacy is protected in setting those up, and then assuring adequate validation, usability, evaluations of the devices. So if you're doing a clinical research study involving university students, for example, here on the campus of the University of Maryland, and they've got internet access and they're tech savvy and they've got all kinds of apps on their phone, that's a different patient population. Those are different assessment of the reliability of the devices for that patient population that if you're dealing with an elderly population that's not very tech savvy, or a poor population where they have unreliable internet. What are you going to do when they don't have internet and can't make connections and upload the data? Is the device going to retain the data and transmit it when that connection is available? So there's a lot to consider, and it's going to be risk-based, right? It's going to be based on the study, what the vendor's being asked to do, and the conditions of that study. So some of the significant challenges that we've seen in recent inspections are related to mishandling, mismanagement, and lack of accessibility to study data. Under FDA's regulations, subject level data is the responsibility of investigators. So in the classic sense, the investigators are the ones who are collecting the data from the patients. They're the ones treating the patient. Well, but in the modern trials, we're seeing the involvement of service providers in a lot of those functions, right? A lot of the efficacy endpoints, maybe the dosing records, are going to be collected by these third-party vendors. It's important to note that that's still investigator data. It's still subject level data. And there's an expectation that that data resides with the investigator. In some cases, that data is going to be blinded. The investigator can't have access to it during the trial, but at least by the end of the trial, that data should reside with the investigator. The investigator should be informed if the sponsor is engaging into a service contract with someone who's going to be collecting subject level data or involved in subject level activities. So that since those are investigator responsibilities, the investigator should be aware of those tasks. It ought to be outlined in the protocol, frankly, but they need to be aware and they need to have access to that data. Anything else that's at subject level data, the regulator is going to expect to have access to via the sponsor. They may use multiple vendors to collect data, but since the sponsor has an oversight function, we expect them to at least be able to understand the key task performed by those service providers and have access to the data that's submitted in the marketing application. So we should be able to reconstruct the study from the sponsor site or through the sponsor, even if they have to engage with the vendors during our site visits and the sponsor inspections. So. And lastly, I think we're seeing, especially with the real-world data, the increase of real-world data in clinical trials, we see transfers of studies from one sponsor to another, to an applicant. And it's important when there is that transfer of study data, either during an active trial or after the trial's been completed, it's important for the sponsor to verify that that data is fit for purpose before it comes to the agency in a marketing application. So if it doesn't meet the criteria, you know, we've talked a lot about what the study criteria should be. With the data criteria, the ALCOA principles of that data, if we can't access the data to verify it, if it doesn't meet the electronic data standards for data integrity, then the sponsor needs to assure that those procedures, those standards are met before they include that data into a marketing application. There we go. So next up, I'd just like to talk about a few cases that we've had in our global inspections. And the first one is we went to a sponsor, a pharmaceutical sponsor inspection, and the sponsor in this case had engaged with a service provider for monitoring activities, very common area, right, for service providers. Well, our inspection revealed that the vendor failed to meet a schedule of visits. And in their visits to the sites for monitoring, they didn't, the scope of the coverage was very limited. Because they didn't comply with the schedule of monitoring visits, then they didn't identify the non-compliances early enough in the trial, and they didn't secure compliance from the investigators. And they didn't act to terminate the investigator site, right? That's our expectation, is that when you see an investigator not following the study protocol, you bring them into compliance as quickly as you can. And if you can't, then we expect you to terminate that investigator. It's important to the safety of the patients, study subjects enrolled in the trial, and it's important to retain the integrity of the data. So in this case, that non-compliance wasn't identified early enough because the study schedule wasn't complied with. Our investigator found that ineligible subjects, based on either their medication history prior to enrollment, their CONMEDs at the time of enrollment, or their disease status, they didn't meet the eligibility criteria for the trial. So that this happened at multiple sites during the study. And our investigator noted there were multiple events where there was either an underdosing or an overdosing of study subjects, again, at multiple sites, not an isolated incident. So she identified that looked at the training provided by the sponsor to the contractor, and it appeared to be inadequate. Also, the fact that these were not isolated incidents, that they were multiple sites, indicates that these were central source to these problems, right? So, I guess the question I have is, for a site like this is, what wasn't done in setting this up? Clearly, there wasn't a good training plan. The sponsor had SOPs, the sponsor had a monitoring plan, but the sponsor failed to properly oversee that vendor and make sure that, that they were following that plan, right? The one thing you can count on with a plan is that it's not going to be completely followed. Life is going to happen, and that's why there's an oversight requirement. So at the end of that study, the end result is we've got a data set that isn't reliable because it's got subjects that shouldn't have been enrolled, and we've got underdosing and overdosing, so it's hard to make conclusions from that. Not only did we fail to follow good clinical practices here, but we failed to protect the safety, rights, and welfare of the subjects that were enrolled in that trial, right? So significant concern in that case. So another case, actually there were two, and I'm going to say medical device trials. I recognize this, we're talking about pharmaceutical trials, but they're very similar. Similar situations can occur in drug trials, but we had two sponsors that engaged with contractors engaged with sites to conduct studies, and they retain responsibility for monitoring. But what we found when we went to conduct these studies is that when the sponsors engaged with these clinical investigators, they did not assure that their agreements covered everything that they needed to access the source data. There were regional privacy considerations, and neither the sponsor was able to monitor those sites and verify the authenticity of the data, nor was FDA able to go and look at those records and verify the accuracy. What the investigator sites had done was extract data from the patient record and put it into an unsecured spreadsheet and provide the spreadsheet as source, as a base for electronic case report forms. But there are no user access controls, there are no audit trails, there's no confidence that the data in that unsecured spreadsheet was accurately recorded and transferred into the ECRFs. So in the end, again, this data was provided to us and it couldn't be verified, and if we can't verify it, it's not really fit for purpose. Lastly, we've been talking about DHTs, so I'll give an example of electronic diaries, which have become very common. So in this particular trial, the patient-reported outcomes, the symptoms, were to be recorded in electronic diaries through a service provider, through a vendor. The investigator could access a portal online and could see whether the patient was reporting their symptoms at the required intervals. And when the patients missed an interval, an email notice was sent to the investigator to notify them there was a gap in the data. Please reach out and fill that gap, right? We need this, we need the patient's symptoms at this time point. And so the process that was set up is that they would have retroactive entries through a paper system that would go through the CRO and be entered into the data set. What we found when we did the clinical investigator inspections is the clinical investigators failed to retain the emails. They didn't see them as a critical study record. So they didn't retain the emails, but they also didn't act on them all the time. They failed to go back to the study subjects and solicit these missed responses or reconcile discrepancies that came in the symptom reports that were filed late. So the retroactive reports were incomplete, and they didn't make an adequate attempt to verify and correct those and get complete information when they could. And so I guess in this case, my question is, was this a study design issue? Was it a site training issue? Was it a subject compliance issue, which is always a problem? Or was it a study oversight issue? Or maybe all of the above, right, in a case like this. So, there were some processes and procedures in place but they weren't followed. And there wasn't enough oversight to catch it early enough and prevent the collection of data that was incomplete. So just to recap, we recognize sponsors rely on multiple contractors to conduct global clinical trials. It's important when contracting that they set up contracts, agreements, and related plans that are well designed and complete and to guide the trial. Sponsors are ultimately responsible. And so training and oversight are going to be key to success in that regard. Here's some resources for you, and we're going to take questions at the end of the day. So thank you. Turn it over next to my colleague, Jason.
You're right, it does make an awful noise. So I'm going to talk a little bit about risk proportionate sponsor oversight, following on from Barbara and Adil. And the kind of things we're going to talk a little bit about, where does the responsibilities sit for this with the regulator? Where does it sit with the sponsor? We're going to talk a little bit about how sponsor oversight has evolved. You know, the days of writing a single trial, writing the protocol, and then sticking with that no matter what, somewhat gone a little bit. These days, trials are much more adaptive. They move on a lot more. So we'll talk a little bit about how that sort of fits then with sponsor oversight, how that sort of works. And then the next bit is to sort of discuss how risk proportionate sponsor oversight sort of works. What kind of things do you need to bear in mind when you run trials which are risk proportionate? So as everybody said, so I'll carry on from Barbara. I'll add a 13th to the list. The sponsor's responsible for the trial. Always has been, always will be. It doesn't matter what they give away, what they delegate out. If you're the sponsor, the responsibilities for that all sit with you. You know, you are responsible for what happens on your trial. And if you're responsible for the trial, you're also responsible for how it's conducted. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're tied into a really hard, static box. There are plenty of ways of working your trial, so it's adaptive, proportionate, all those kind of things. It also fits with this idea that for a long time, there's been a real move towards regulatory acceptance of risk adaptation, risk proportionality. You know, certainly in the UK, we published guidance back in sort of 2012, over 10 years ago, talking about risk adaptive measures, risk proportionality, different types of trials and the risks associated with them. And then we continue to build on this. You know, we keep talking about how do you risk adapt your trial, what's proportionate in terms of what you're trying to achieve with your trial, the kind of data you're trying to capture. Do you need the belt and braces forensic approach to data collection? Are you trying to achieve data perfection? Or are you trying to capture sort of enough? That everybody's comfortable that what you're doing sort of works, sort of fits together. Historically, I think there's been quite a lot of reticence from sponsors to adapt some or adopt some of this risk proportionality. You know, what's the regulator going to say when I turn up and say, and I didn't do this and I didn't do that and I only did a tiny little bit of this because I believed it wasn't important. So we already see it on inspection where we see often belt and braces. But in some respects, the more important bit is when you then go and submit it later on and the assessor goes, well, that's no good to me. You didn't do a thing, whatever that thing might be. And at which point you can't put it back. You know, the trial's finished, your patients have been sort of disbanded. It's very difficult to go back to the data you have available to you and go, oh, you know, how can we bolt some extra bits on the side to bolster this if you haven't done it? So it's sort of the time really for sponsors to sort of accept that as regulators. We've been quite comfortable with this for a while, but you need to have processes and approaches for managing it, for working out what's important, for working with it, rather than just go, no, we must do everything. We must achieve data perfection. We must achieve total rigid control over everything which happens on a trial. As regulators, we continue to push risk proportionality, and we see that across all sorts of things. And we've push it more and more each year. You know, we've talked about it for a long time. We've encouraged you to do it. You're now starting to see it appear in guidance. We're seeing it appear in ICH, and more of that in a minute. So now's the time. If you haven't already, you're starting to be pushed towards it. And at some point, you're going to have to do it, whether that's little baby steps or whether that's you're going to be dragged kicking and screaming into having to achieve risk proportionality, whether you like it or not. So it's a continuing evolution, really. And so just a couple of examples in here. We've talked a lot about E6R3, and we'll probably continue to do so over the rest of the day. But also to drop in here the UK clinical trial regulation update. So we ran a consultation in there. We talked about risk proportionality. And in this, the kind of things we're looking for is we now expect risk identification by the sponsor. It's no longer a nice to have. You know, we expect you to look through, work out what it means, what it looks like, to have active processes for identifying these things. We then expect you to think about how you mitigate against it and what's proportionate for it, what's important in your trial, what data points are important, what elements of control are important, and how you put those in. We talk a lot about quality by design. So it's thinking up front what you're going to do rather than trying to bolt quality on later. You know, trying to keep the wheels on the quality bus is very difficult if you haven't planned to put the axles in the first place. And then making sure that you're not giving additional burden almost across the system. So we know our investigators are so busy. They are trying to run multiple trials. They've got their normal patient populations to stay on top of. Trials are becoming more and more complex. We're adding more and more things for them to do, whether that's oversight through decentralized trials, whether that's additional electronic systems. We're asking them to manage more and more electronic systems, more and more things they no longer have sort of full control of or full understanding, and every trial is different. So what we're trying to do ultimately is to support flexibility of trials. And we saw quite a lot of this during the pandemic, without stealing some of my slides from the next presentation. What we're trying to achieve here is that you're flexible with these things. Very few trials run exactly to plan, unless they're really simple. But in reality, as sponsors, you're trying to build more and more complicated trials to achieve as much bang for your buck across the patch. You know, how can you achieve as much data as possible? How can you draw all that lot in the hope that in the future you can chuck it all into some kind of data lake or whatever it might be, and then you'll have tools to put it back out again. But is that right for the patients? Is that right for the trial sites trying to achieve this? How do you build your trials to collect all this kind of useful information rather than just having it for having its sake? So I was sort of hunting around a little bit to go, oh, how can I nicely describe this and fit it together? But actually ICH E6R3, much as it's still draft at the moment, still being worked on, does this really nicely. And so the next two slides are literally a cut and paste of that text. So I'll read the first bit, you can read the rest at your leisure. So clinical trial processes, measures and approaches should be implemented in a way that's proportionate to the risk to participants and to the importance of the data being collected. So there's no point putting in place huge amounts of effort for data which perhaps is supportive rather than actually associated with your prime endpoints, this kind of thing. You know, if age isn't necessarily that important, why are you spending a huge amount of time making sure it's right? You know, go off and perhaps look at the things which are a little bit more relevant. Look at the risks which are there for your trial and work out how they sort of fit in all of this. We've got to look after our trial participants. You know, are they safe? Are we looking after their data? Are we looking after their confidentiality? How do we make sure results are reliable? What kind of things do we need to put in place? So is it enough that you push it all to the sponsor, all to the investigator, leave it all with them? It's your job. You know, we were talking yesterday, I think, there were a couple of questions lurking in one of the sessions about access to sites. And sites perhaps saying to the monitors, well, you know, we don't really have time for you to come. We don't want you to come on site. But remote monitoring will only do so much. But actually, remote monitoring is a nice, powerful tool. But every now and then, there are things which you almost need to be on site to go and have a look at. There are pros and cons with both approaches. The other part of the principle in this, so just working through these a little bit, is working out sort of the level of risk with the trial. So is it above and beyond the standards of sort of routine medical care? If it's above that, what else do you need to do? What other steps do you need to put in place? And then you need to manage your critical to quality factors, trying to work out what's important in that trial. And that leads us nicely on to thinking about risk adaptation and risk assessments and things in a minute. But in order to set the groundwork for that a little bit, not all trials are the same. And what we often see when we go out on inspection is almost a boilerplate approach to quality. We have a set on the shelf, and we pull it down, we put it out there, and then try and force the trial to fit into that standard approach. But that's not often the case. They don't lend themselves to that. You know, a very risky oncology trial with all sorts of bells and whistles on top of it versus a little bit of a Me Too kind of, we do this regularly kind of trial. They're very different. They need different approaches. There's a shift in focus onto the reliability of results rather than data perfection. It's about what's important, what matters, when you come to do the analysis later on, what do you really need to be on top of? What gives you the most out of your data? And then finally, just thinking about, it's not enough just to have risk-based quality management at a trial level. You also need some of the other supporting processes within your organisation. If your organisation is risk-averse as a sponsor and isn't prepared to accept this sort of risk-based, proportionate, moving kind of approach, you're going to struggle to put in place all of those kind of steps you need for it. So there needs to be some adoption of that. So, get asked all the time about risk assessments. We've all been doing them for years, is the thing, but we keep getting asked about how to do it. What do we need to do? There was some discussion yesterday about making sure that as inspectors and regulators that we also perform these appropriately, that we are comfortable with how you do your risk assessments and so on. So they sort of line up against three things really: safety of the trial participant, the trial results themselves, and then the integrity of the data. They're sort of the three big buckets that they sit around. And then for each of those, it's working out what's appropriate in terms of those mitigations you put in place to fit with those things that you've identified as being important to your trial. Really key to all of this, and we see it all the time on inspection, is that you see a nice solid risk assessment at the beginning of the trial. When everything's lined up, real life hasn't happened yet. At the moment, at that point in time, it's a bit of a wish list, your protocol. This is how things will happen, or this is how we expect things to occur. Patients will always meet their visit windows, we'll never have any supply problems, all of our technologies will work exactly as we expect them to, there will be no wobbles along the way. We know that's not real life, but that risk assessment is all powerful. It's where we define how things fit together. But what we actually need to do is to keep coming back to them. We actively need to manage those risks that are there. And with that, as the trial starts to rumble along and you start to see that perhaps some of these visits are more difficult for participants to achieve, or perhaps one of the technologies isn't as useful as you thought it was going to be and you've identified a bit of a gap, auditing or monitoring, identify things which are a problem, trying to fit those back into the risk assessment. So they're no longer a point in time, they have to be adaptive. You have to keep coming back to it, it needs to be a living document. You also need to look at the mitigations you've put in place, because again, when you put them in place at the beginning, it's in this ideal world kind of idea. It's, of course it will work. Here's my mitigation, it's amazing. I've put in place a check, whatever it might be. But what it isn't is it's not baptized in the fire of real life at that point in time. You know, will it stand the test of being pushed out to the investigators to do, or the monitors to collect something, or a system to be able to show you your nice green boxes in your dashboard? So you need to look at whether or not they're suitable. You need to look at whether or not they're effective. If you don't have effective risk control strategies, then again, it's a, how do you know it's doing what you think it's doing? Or are you just collecting some other piece of data which doesn't actually show you that it's doing what it's meant to be doing? And then finally, can you document it? What is it actually doing? Or is it just a thing which happens in the background? Are you actively assessing it? So your risk management needs to be ongoing, definitely not point in time. And these are some things to think about with all of that. So at the beginning, you've got sort of the nature of the trial. Is it a pivotal trial? Is it a supportive, an additional trial? Do you need to put different kind of resourcing into that? How complex is the design? And certainly Adil was talking earlier on about different types of trial design. What about the IMP? Is it simple to use? Have you done different things with it? Does it need a whole load of manipulation? And all of these add complexity. Same with trial endpoints, same with the various interventions. What are you actually doing to that poor participant that's on your trial? Do things stack up so they have an easy journey through their participation in the trial? How does it all work in terms of the experience? And I sort of hate the term, but it's quite true. You know, what's the sponsor experience look like? What's the service provider experience look like? What does the investigator experience look like? And certainly post-pandemic, we know that the investigator experience has changed. You know, once upon a while, the monitor would come on site, they would do lots of checks, they would run around, but in essence, you dump them in a room full of paper or maybe a computer and let them get on with it. This experience has changed now because actually they ask for access to their electronic health records and maybe a Zoom call or whatever it might be. And so it's now been pushed onto the site to sort of manage that a little bit more rather than the monitor. Complexity. Trials are more and more complex. More and more vendors, more and more technologies, more and more interactions between things. Things have to happen in a particular order, so the sequencing becomes more important. And then particularly with that sort of information flow as it pushes around the system, as it's driven by System A talks to System B, which triggers IMP over here and maybe a particular visit or a scheduling of a scan or something or other. And also location-wise, very few trials now just occur in a single location. You know, and certainly the minute you start dropping vendors into that, you've got vendors all over the world doing different bits and pieces. So they've become more and more complex. How do you stay on top of all of that? And certainly for a sponsor, how do you retain enough oversight, control, knowledge of all these millions of moving parts, with everybody with their own different bits of quality system, their own understanding of how things happen, their own interpretation of what they think the trial is? So that brings me a little bit to what do you need as a sponsor? What's the expectations for the kind of systems you need? Well, in essence, your quality system needs to enshrine risk-proportionate approaches. So when you look through your SOPs, when you look through your quality documents, does it explain what they are? Or the kind of things which a project manager or a monitor or a project delivery specialist, whatever, that they can pull from a toolbox? Or does it just have one approach? And then it's covered somewhere else, or it's a departure from your established processes. So do your SOPs talk about it? Are your audits adaptive? Again, when you're sending your auditors out, are they looking about what's important when they're being tasked? You know, go and look at the important things on the trial rather than going to try and pick every aspect of the trial to ensure that perfection of data. What about training for staff? Do you train them to be comfortable with taking appropriate risk proportionate decisions? You know, and supporting them when they make those decisions. Because if you don't, then you're sort of lining them up to fail a little bit, because you're not going to make some leap in the dark if you don't think your organisation has got you. So and with that, there's a real need for management support. If management aren't bought into, we're going to adopt risk proportionality, we're going to adopt risk adaptation into how we conduct our clinical trials and how we manage them, then nobody's ever going to do it. They're not going to take the leap in the dark. They're going to stick with safe. We must do 100% SDV. We must do 100% of this. Our audits will always check the following things, regardless of whether it's important or not. Then brings you to the trial itself. So what's your oversight strategy? All these things listed on the slide, they're all things you know and love. Plans, charters, strategies, all those kind of things. They're all known entities to you. But actually, do you define risk adaptation? Do you define risk mitigation? Do you define various approaches you could use depending on what happens in them? Or are they a little bit built in time when everything is perfect? It's important to think about all of these, and certainly on inspection, we look through them to see, one, what latitude you give yourselves within it, but equally how you live and learn with them. If this happens, what are we going to do? How do we work within it? It's important to have this ongoing risk review. So I mentioned at the beginning, your risk assessment at the beginning is one thing, but trials change. Real life happens. The minute you push it out into the real world, the minute you start getting trial participants through the door, things change. And we often see this lack of ongoing risk review. So see the risk assessment at the beginning, but it then doesn't keep track with real life. So we often see where a protocol amendment happens, but there's no revision of the risk assessment. But by this point, you've changed all sorts of things, added another arm or added in some extra tests, dropped a whole load of stuff, whatever it might be. Same with supporting processes, same with vendors, same with different solutions and things. You know, somebody brings out a new whizzy piece of technology and you go, oh, that'd be awesome, we'll use that in our trial. But it then doesn't fall into the risk assessment because it wasn't done at the beginning. And we often see those changes happen in the trial, but the risk assessments, the risk mitigations don't keep pace with it. So really important to see those risk assessments as a living document, and the same with the mitigations. Do they continue to be appropriate? Are they effective? Are they doing what you think they need to do? So what does it look like? As an inspector, when we're out there, what does risk proportionate effective sponsor oversight look like? So when we're talking to people, and it often comes from that, it's, do people understand what the key aspects of the trial are? You know, can they talk to me about what's critical to quality, what needs to happen in order to get a nice solid primary endpoint? And from that, what do the mitigations look like? What's the risk assessment say? What do the mitigations look like? How do I protect that primary endpoint? And I protect it by having these various strategies and plans and checks and balances in place. And if all of those work, then hopefully my data should be solid. And then you can go off and use it for supporting your marketing authorization application or whatever else you're going to do with it. And then how does the rest of it fit together with all the millions of moving parts and contractors and specialist systems and all those kind of things? How do they fit? How does data move around the system? And again, what's important from all of that? So we're looking for people to be able to talk through that, because it's easy if you live it, but it's very difficult to pull it together if you don't. And ultimately, can you relate it back to participant safety and the reliability of the data? Because if you can't, then there's a bit of an issue there. That's where it needs to come back to. If you're doing it just because, then is it effective? Is it doing what you expect it to do? Mentioned some of these already. Risk review, you know, do you document it? Is it something which just happens in meetings but actually never gets written down anywhere? Do you document your decision making? And that's often the hardest bit for us, that something happens and you go, well, why did you decide to do that? Oh, well, you know, we just did. Why? Where does it say that? Who sat down in a meeting and decided that actually this was an effective course of action, that this was the way you were going to go? And what does that mean? And if you've got that kind of stuff documented, then it's a little bit easier for us as inspectors when we turn up on site to see what you were thinking at the time. And worst case is all the people that made those decisions have now left. And you're the poor soul holding the TMF at that point in time going, I've no idea why my colleagues did this, but that's just what they decided to do. Ultimately, we look for staff to be empowered to adopt risk proportionality and empowered to act. If you see a problem, go and do something about it. So in summary, it's important to understand the purpose of the trial. It's important to understand how the conduct of the trial is going to happen, how you plan it, and then actually being able to react to real life. It's important that all of you promote flexibility in your trial designs and flexibility in the conduct of your trial. And then with risk assessments, I've put here, get into the detail, but don't go mad. But you need to understand that your trials are complex. So don't just do, only going to do the IMP. You know, think about how it fits together. Think about what's important for your trial and make sure those risk assessments are ongoing. My closing thought for you is in some respects, it's very much time for your sponsors to adopt risk proportionality. You have support from the regulators to do this. You know, there's guidance out there. If you need more examples, you need more support, ask for it. We are looking to support the adoption of risk proportionality. And in some respects, we're a little bit in your hands too, in terms of what you need. So more than happy to catch up with people later on. If you think there are obvious things missing, by all means, come talk to me. And I'll add them to my list.